I need your rifle, Chief. Excuse me. Right now. Because the commander bleeds out in 4 minutes, and half this team dies in less than that if somebody doesn't put that shooter down. Master Chief Roan Kessler had 30 years in the teams. He'd never handed his weapon to a medic in his life. He handed it to her anyway. 600 yards. Crosswind pulling hard from the left. A shot most qualified snipers wouldn't have attempted under fire. With borrowed glass in the dark, she settled into the rock. Breathed the way her father taught her when she was 7 years old. In for 4, hold for 4, out for 4. The ridge line went silent, and every man on that mountain turned to look at the woman they'd spent 6 days calling the patch-up girl, wondering who she really was, and why nobody had ever bothered to ask.
The wind came off the bay at 6 every morning, cold, salted, steady enough to set a watch by. Sloane Ashworth stood at the edge of the range with a rifle that wasn't hers, in a uniform that wasn't quite hers either, and she breathed out slow. 5 foot 3 inches of quiet, deceptive stillness, dark hair pulled back tight enough that nobody would ever call it anything but practical, though more than one man on this base had noticed her. Anyway, had noticed the sharp gray-blue eyes and the composed, striking face that seemed permanently unaware of its own effect on a room. She'd learned a long time ago to let people notice and move on. 1 count, 2, the way her father taught her before she was old enough to understand what the lessons were actually for. Center mass. Exhale. Hold. The round went downrange and the paper target 400 yards out folded at the shoulder like it had been punched by something invisible. Nobody clapped. Nobody ever clapped for her, because that wasn't her job. Her job was gauze and tourniquets and calling out vitals over gunfire. Her job was kneeling in the mud with someone else's blood soaking through her knee pads while men who didn't trust her decided whether she'd earned the right to be there, which she hadn't. Not according to them. Not with a name like Ashworth stitched over her heart. She lowered the rifle before anyone could ask why a combat medic was putting 5 rounds into a sniper target with a $100 zero and hands that didn't shake. She'd gotten good at lowering things fast. Rifles, eyes, expectations. Because she remembered the first time her father put a rifle in her hands. She was 7. Small enough that the stock had to be adjusted twice before it fit against her shoulder right. He knelt behind her in the tall grass of a range nobody else knew existed, some borrowed land 2 counties over from where they lived, and he didn't talk about killing. He talked about patience. The rifle doesn't care if you're scared, he told her. The rifle only cares if you're still. She hadn't understood it then. She understood it now, every single day in 100 small moments where stillness was the only thing standing between chaos and control. He taught her the way some fathers taught their daughters to ride a bike or bait a hook or drive a stick shift on an empty road at 16. Except what he taught her wasn't for sport and it wasn't for safety, and some deep, quiet part of her had always understood that he was preparing her for something specific, something he never named. Something that made her mother go pale and leave the room whenever the lessons started. Sloane never asked why. Children rarely question the strange gravity of the things their parents insist on. They just absorb it, fold it into the architecture of who they're becoming and carry it forward, without a name for it until much later, if ever. Now she was 27, and the architecture was still there, buried under years of nursing school and trauma rotations and a medical corps uniform that was supposed to be the opposite of everything her father once was. Buried, but never gone. Never even close to gone. She slung the borrowed rifle over her shoulder and walked the long way back to the aid station, past the flagpole, past the rows of gray buildings that all looked the same, past a bulletin board with a photograph of Task Unit Cormorant's last training exercise pinned up like a trophy. She didn't stop to look at it. She already knew she wasn't in it. Nobody ever put the medic in the photograph, because the story always came first. Before her training, before the 11 years she'd spent becoming exactly the kind of quietly excellent that nobody was supposed to notice. Everett Ashworth, Colonel. Ghost. The man who vanished on a classified operation when Sloane was 9 years old and came home in nothing but a folded flag and a report that used the word desertion like it was a fact instead of a verdict somebody had decided on without a trial. She grew up under that word, wore it to school, wore it to her mother's funeral 8 years later when the grief and the shame had finally finished eating the woman from the inside out. Wore it now, at 27, standing on a Navy base in coastal Virginia, surrounded by men who'd read her file before they ever read her face. Ashworth. The voice came from behind her, flat, testing. She turned. Petty Officer Tate Corrigan stood with his arms crossed, 24 years old and built like an argument looking for somewhere to happen. "That your rifle?" he asked. "No. Didn't think so." He nodded at the target. "Nice grouping. For a medic." "Thanks. Wasn't a compliment." Wasn't expecting one. Silence. The kind that had teeth. She'd met 100 versions of Tate Corrigan over the years, different faces, same posture, same need to prove something to a woman who hadn't asked them to prove anything at all. She used to fight it, used to argue, explain, defend, a father she barely remembered, against men who'd never met him and never would. She didn't fight it anymore. Fighting it cost more than it was worth, and she'd learned exactly how much she had to spend. "You know what they say about your old man around here," Corrigan said, not a question. "I've heard a few versions. Heard he ran, left his own men out to dry. Heard your mama couldn't even get a folded flag without somebody in records making a face about it." Something in Sloane went very still. Not her hands. Her hands never moved. It was something underneath the hands, something older, something that had learned a long time ago to stay quiet and let the insult pass through like weather. "You finished?" she asked. "Just making conversation. Make it somewhere else." He smiled like he'd won something, walked off toward the barracks whistling, and Sloane stood there another minute with the rifle that wasn't hers, breathing the way her father taught her. In for 4, hold for 4, out for 4. Because if she let herself feel the whole weight of it right there on the range, in front of God and the wind and every SEAL on this base who thought she was a liability wearing a stethoscope, she wasn't sure she'd be able to stand back up. So she didn't feel it. She locked it away the way she'd locked away everything else, and she went back to the aid station and she got to work. Lieutenant Commander Beckett Voss found her there an hour later, elbow deep in supply crates, counting IV bags like the number mattered more than anything else in the world. "You settling in?" he asked. "As much as anyone settles in around here. Corrigan giving you trouble?" "Corrigan's fine." Voss studied her a second too long. He was 38 silver already threading through his temples, the kind of officer who'd learned to read a room before he learned to read a map. "You know I didn't pick you for this unit." "I'm aware. Doesn't mean I don't need you. Means I didn't get a say." He crossed his arms. "Command attached you because you're the best trauma medic on this coast. That's the only reason you're here. Not your last name, not what happened to your father, none of that." "Careful, Commander." Almost sounded kind. "Don't get used to it." But there was something almost gentle in the way he said it. Something that told her he'd read more of her file than he was letting on, and maybe didn't believe every word of it. He leaned against the doorframe, watching her stack trauma kits with the same precision she brought to everything. "For what it's worth," he said, "I lost a corpsman 2 deployments back. Good kid. Green, but good. Died because the medic we had before you froze under fire. So I don't care whose daughter you are, Ashworth. I care whether you freeze." "I don't freeze." "We'll see." "You say that like it's a threat." "It's not a threat." He almost smiled. Almost. "It's the only test that's ever mattered out here." Almost. Not quite. Nobody quite believed her, not yet, and she'd stopped expecting them to, because belief was a thing you earned in this world, one impossible moment at a time, and she hadn't had her moment. Not yet. She didn't know it would come in 6 days. She didn't know it would come soaked in blood and dust 11,000 miles from this base, in a country nobody back home could find on a map, with a rifle in her hands that everyone would swear up and down she had no business holding. She just kept counting IV bags. kept breathing, kept waiting for whatever came next. It came in the form of a briefing room and a folder marked with a classification level most people on this base weren't cleared for. Task Unit Cormorant was deploying, 6 days out. A hostage recovery operation in a mountainous region of a fractured fictional border state the briefing officer referred to only by a code name, Site Halvern, where a downed contractor and 2 aid workers were being held by an armed faction with ties to a weapons network the U.S. had been tracking for over a year. Sloane sat in the back of the room, the only woman in it, and listened to Voss lay out the operational plan in a voice that didn't waver even once. The satellite imagery filled the screen behind him. Gray ridge lines, a scatter of low buildings pressed into a fold of rock like something trying to hide from its own coordinates. Sloane studied the terrain the way she studied everything now, automatically, instinctively, some old part of her brain already calculating sight lines and choke points before her conscious mind caught up to what it was doing. "Stop it," she told herself. "You're a medic. Medics don't read terrain like that." Except she did. She always had. Ever since she was a girl standing behind her father on some anonymous stretch of borrowed land, learning to see a landscape the way a hunter sees it, or the way prey sees it, depending on which side of the rifle you were standing on. Insertion by helicopter, 6 clicks of foot movement through broken terrain, a compound with 3 confirmed structures and unconfirmed numbers of hostiles. "Any questions?" Voss said, and the room stayed quiet because there weren't questions. Not really. Not the kind you asked out loud in a briefing room the night before you flew somewhere that might kill you. Sloane skipped the mess hall that night, sat instead on the steps outside her quarters with a protein bar she didn't eat and a memory she hadn't let surface in months. Her mother, standing in the kitchen of the house they used to have. Before the house got sold, before the money ran out, the way money always ran out for families whose fathers were declared dishonorably absent instead of honorably dead. Margaret Ashworth had been a school teacher, patient with other people's children in a way she sometimes struggled to be patient with her own grief. "They're going to say things about him," her mother told her once the night before Sloane's first day at a new school in a new town, the 4th new town in 6 years. "People always find out. And when they do, they're going to say things. What do I say back?" "Nothing," her mother said. "You say nothing, and you hold your head up, and you let them believe whatever makes them feel better about a man they never met and never will." Sloane had asked once, only once, whether her mother believed the official story. Whether she thought her husband really had walked away from his men, from his country, from the family that spent the rest of its life paying for a sin it never understood. Her mother hadn't answered, not with words. She'd just gone very quiet the way she always went quiet when the subject came too close to something underneath it, and poured herself another glass of wine and changed the subject to homework or dinner or anything else that wasn't the hole where her husband used to be. Sloane understood now, sitting on cold concrete steps with an unopened protein bar in her hand, that her mother's silence had never been agreement. It had been fear. The particular corrosive fear of a woman who suspected the truth was worse than the lie and safer left buried. She thought about Kessler's face in the dark 6 nights ago, the way certainty had moved across it like weather. And she thought for the first time in longer than she wanted to admit that maybe her mother had been wrong to bury it. Maybe some things needed digging up no matter what they cost to unearth. She stood finally and went inside to finish packing her kit. "Doc Ashworth is attached for medical," Voss said, and she felt every head in the room turn toward her at once. Not friendly. Not hostile either, just weighing. Corrigan didn't turn. He was already looking at her. He'd been looking at her the whole briefing, actually, like he was waiting for her to flinch. She didn't flinch, because flinching was a thing you did when you weren't sure, and she was sure. She'd trained for this her whole life, without ever admitting that's what the training was for. The old man found her that night outside the aid station, sitting on an overturned crate with a cup of coffee gone cold in her hands. Master Chief Rowan Kessler, 60 years old, built like something carved rather than born, with a face full of the kind of lines that only came from decades of sun and worse things than sun. He'd been quiet around her since she arrived, watching more than talking. She'd noticed it, tucked it into the back of her mind, and kept moving, because she didn't have time to think about it yet. He sat down next to her without asking, didn't say anything for a long moment, just looked out at the dark water past the fence line. "You shoot left-handed on the range today?" he said, "even though you write right-handed." "I noticed you noticed." "I notice a lot of things." He turned his cup in his hands. "Your stance, your breathing pattern, the way you settle into a rest instead of fighting it." A pause. "I've seen that exact stance one other time in my life." Something cold moved through her chest. "That right. Long time ago, different war, different country." He wasn't looking at her now. He was looking somewhere else entirely, somewhere 20 years gone. "Man who taught it to me is dead now, or that's what they told us." Sloane's hands went very still around the cold coffee. "You're going to tell me you don't know what I'm talking about," Kessler said. "I don't know what you're talking about." "All right." He stood, knees cracking, and looked down at her with an expression she couldn't quite name. Not suspicion, something closer to grief. "I'll tell you something else then, since you're pretending not to listen. The man I knew, the one with that stance. He wasn't the kind of man people write off easy. Whatever happened to him, whatever got written down in whatever file the Navy keeps on men like that, I never believed a word of it. Not one word. Some stories get written by the people who benefit most from them being believed." Sloane said nothing. Her throat had gone tight enough that she wasn't sure she could have spoken even if she'd wanted to. "We'll leave it there," Kessler said, "for now." He walked off into the dark, and Sloane sat there a long time after he was gone, coffee gone colder, heart going faster than she wanted it to. Because if he knew, if he'd actually recognized something in the way she held a weapon, then the wall she'd spent 18 years building around the truth about her father had just developed its first crack, and cracks didn't stay small. She knew that better than anyone. 6 days went by, the way 6 days before a deployment always went by, too fast and too slow at the same time. Gear checks, medical inventory, long nights running trauma scenarios in her head until she could close her eyes and see every possible way a body could fail and every possible way to stop it from failing. Voss found her in the supply room the night before the flight out, going through her kit for the 3rd time, even though she'd already checked every item twice. "You don't need to recheck it again," he said from the doorway. "Helps me think. Or it helps you not think about something else." He leaned against the frame, arms crossed, studying her the way he always did, like a man reading weather he couldn't quite name yet. "Kessler talk to you again? A little? He tell you anything worth losing sleep over?" Sloane looked up, weighing how much to say, how much this man had already earned the right to hear. "Maybe. That's not a no." "No," she agreed. "It's not." Voss nodded slowly, not pushing. "Whatever it is, Ashworth, you don't have to carry it alone out there tomorrow. I know you're used to that. Doesn't mean you should be." She didn't answer that, not directly, because she didn't yet trust herself to say it out loud without her voice breaking. But she held on to the words anyway, folded them somewhere next to the ones her father had written her, and went back to checking a kit that didn't need checking a 3rd time. She didn't sleep much that week. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw her father's hands over hers, adjusting her grip, murmuring the same 4 words he always murmured. Slow is smooth, smooth is fast. She used to think it was just a saying. Now she understood it was closer to a prayer, the kind of thing a man repeats to a child because he doesn't know how many more lessons he'll get to give her. On the 4th night, she drove alone to the edge of the base cemetery, the one she visited every year on this date and never told anyone about, and stood with her hand flat against her mother's headstone, saying nothing out loud, because there was nothing left to say that hadn't already been said 100 times before. Margaret Ashworth, beloved wife, beloved mother. No mention of the husband, who was supposed to be buried somewhere else in a grave that existed mostly on paper, under a stone that said things Sloane had never fully believed. "I might be close," she whispered to the headstone. "I don't know yet, but I might be close to finding out what actually happened to him." The wind didn't answer. It never did. But she stood there a while longer anyway, the way she always did before driving back to base to finish packing a kit that could save a life or fail to, depending on how the next 6 days went. Then the helicopter, and the dark, and the mountains rising up underneath them like the teeth of something ancient. Sight Halvern didn't look like much from the air. A cluster of low buildings pressed into a fold of rock, a single dirt road threading in from the east. No lights, no movement that the thermal imaging could catch. Which should have been the first warning. Voss said as much on the descent, jaw tight under his helmet. "Too quiet."
"Could be asleep," Corrigan offered.
"Could be waiting," Voss said. He was right. Of course, he was right. Because nothing about this deployment was going to be simple, and some part of Sloane had known that the moment Kessler sat down next to her on that overturned crate and told her about a stance he'd seen exactly once before. The insertion went clean. The first 400 meters went clean. Boots on gravel, night vision washing the world in green, and static the compound sitting silent up ahead like it was holding its breath along with them. Sloane moved in the middle of the formation, medical ruck heavy against her spine, every sense pulled taut, the way it always got in the minutes before something happened. She counted her steps out of habit, a trick her father taught her, a way of keeping the mind occupied so fear didn't have room to take root. 60, 80, 120. Beside her, Corrigan moved with the easy economy of a man who'd done this 100 times, rifle up eyes, scanning, a professional stillness in his shoulders that hadn't been there back on the range when he was busy proving something to a woman who hadn't asked him to prove anything at all. Out here, apparently, all of that fell away. Out here, there was only the mission and the ground and the dark pressing in from every side. 200 meters. The compound's silhouette sharpened against the ridge, 3 low structures exactly where the satellite imagery said they'd be. No lights, no movement. Nothing but wind moving loose gravel across open ground. Too quiet. Voss had said it on the descent, and he'd been right, and Sloane felt the truth of it now in her own chest, a tightness that had nothing to do with the weight of her ruck. Then the world came apart. Gunfire from 3 directions at once. Not a handful of fighters, a prepared position. Someone had known they were coming, and Sloane didn't have time to wonder how before she was flat against a rock outcropping with rounds cracking past close enough to feel the heat of them. "Contact, contact," Voss's voice cutting through the chaos. Then a different sound, a wet, terrible sound, and Voss went down behind a boulder with blood already spreading dark across his side. "Commander's hit!" someone screamed. Sloane moved before her brain finished processing the order. She was already crawling, already reaching for her kit, bullets chewing the dirt 6 inches from her hand while she pressed both palms hard against a wound that was trying to empty a grown man of everything that kept him alive. "Stay with me," she said, low, steady, the voice she used for every dying man who'd ever bled on her. "Look at me. Voss, look at me." His eyes found hers, glassy, fighting to focus. "Bad. You've had worse haircuts." A ghost of a laugh turned into a cough, turned into more blood. Her hands worked without her having to think about the sequence anymore. Pressure. Packing. The particular angle you had to hold a wound like this so gravity helped instead of hurt. Years of trauma bays and field hospitals had built the motions into her the same way her father had built other motions into her, until the 2 kinds of training sat side by side in her hands, indistinguishable in the moment when both of them mattered at once. "Talk to me," she said. "Tell me something, anything." "Got a daughter?" Voss managed, teeth gritted against the pain. 8 years old. Soccer. "Good, keep talking about her." "Scored a goal last week. Sent me the video." His breath hitched, caught, steadied, made me watch it 4 times before I left. "You're going to watch it a 5th time?" Sloane said, and meant it as an order more than a comfort. "You hear me, Commander? 5th time!" Tonight! Around them, the gunfire hadn't slowed. If anything, it had tightened, focused, the wild opening volley giving way to the patient, disciplined rhythm of someone who knew exactly what they were doing and wasn't in any hurry to stop doing it. Around them, the team was pinned. Split into two positions by a wash of open ground the enemy had turned into a kill box, Corrigan and two others cut off on the far side with no clean line back. Radios full of static and shouted coordinates that weren't landing. Sloane's mind, even while her hands worked the wound, kept doing the thing it always did, calculating, measuring. Some part of her that had nothing to do with medicine was already tracking the rhythm of the incoming fire, the spacing between shots, the particular discipline of a shooter who wasn't panicking, who was taking his time, who was good. Which meant this wasn't some disorganized militia stumbling into a firefight. This was someone trained, someone patient, someone exactly like the kind of person her father used to describe on those long afternoons in the tall grass back when she was small enough to need the stock adjusted twice. And that was when Sloane realized nobody was coming to close that gap. Not in the next 60 seconds, not before whoever was dug in on the ridgeline finished what they'd started. She looked up, 600 yards out, maybe more, a shooting position tucked into rock she wouldn't have seen if she hadn't spent a childhood learning exactly where a man would hide if he wanted a clean angle on people who couldn't see him coming. Kessler was 10 feet away, laying down what suppressing fire he could, jaw-locked eyes, scanning a ridgeline he couldn't quite place the threat on. Chief Sloane said. He didn't look at her. "Kinda busy, Doc? You're 2 o'clock, split rock formation. That's your shooter." Now he looked at her. "I need your rifle," she said. "Excuse me? I need your rifle, Chief, and I need it right now because Voss is going to bleed out in about 4 minutes, and Corrigan's team is going to get cut to pieces in less than that if somebody doesn't put that shooter down first." Something passed over Kessler's face. Disbelief, calculation, and underneath both of those, something that looked almost like recognition. He handed her the rifle. Later, much later, he would tell people he didn't know why he did it, that some instinct, older than rank or protocol, had made the decision before his conscious mind caught up. In the moment, he just watched her take the weapon, the way a person takes something they've held 1,000 times before, though as far as he knew, she'd never held one like it in her life. Sloane settled into the rock, found the angle, breathed the way her father taught her before she was old enough to know what the lessons were actually for. In for 4. The world narrowed the way it always did when everything else fell away. The gunfire, the shouting, Voss's ragged breathing under her other hand, all of it receded into something distant background noise behind a single point of focus that felt less like concentration and more like coming home to a version of herself she'd spent 18 years keeping locked in a room nobody else was allowed to enter. 600 yards, crosswind pulling from the left maybe 8 miles an hour. The kind of wind that would push a lesser shot a foot off target at this range, and nobody would ever know why. Dust rising faint off the rock face. Heat shimmer just starting to bend the air at the edges of her scope. Hold for 4. Her father's voice, 20 years gone and still exactly as clear as if he were kneeling behind her right now. Watch the mirage, Sloane girl. The air lies before the wind does. She adjusted. Not by calculation exactly, by something deeper than calculation, something built into her hands over more years than she'd ever admitted to anyone on this base, in this unit, in this life she'd built specifically so nobody would ask the question she was terrified of answering. Out for 4. The trigger broke clean, the way a good trigger always does, more surprise than intention, and the round left the barrel and crossed 600 yards of hostile air in under a second, and the ridgeline went quiet. Not quiet like before, quiet like a held breath finally released. The suppressing fire from the far position simply stopped, and for 3 full seconds nobody moved, nobody breathed, the whole battlefield hanging on whether that single shot had done what it needed to do. Then Corrigan's voice, cracking with something between relief and disbelief, crackled over the radio. "Shooter's down. Repeat, shooter is down." Sloane handed the rifle back to Kessler without a word and turned back to Voss, whose eyes were fluttering, whose blood pressure she didn't need a cuff to know was dropping into territory that killed people. "Stay with me," she said again. "You don't get to die on my watch, Commander. Not today." She worked, hands steady, even as everything else in her screamed. Packed the wound, called for the medevac bird, kept talking to him in that low, even voice because sometimes that was the only medicine that mattered. The sound of someone refusing to let you go. The bird came. Voss went out on it alive, barely, but alive. The rest of the team folded back to the extraction point in the gray hour before dawn, exhausted, alive. Every single one of them. And every single one of them looking at Sloane Ashworth like she'd just become someone else entirely. The medevac bird landed 20 minutes ahead of the rest of the team, and by the time Sloane's boots hit the tarmac back at base, word had already traveled the way it always did in places like this, faster than any official report, faster than truth usually managed to move. Voss went straight into surgery. The trauma team met the bird at the pad, and Sloane gave her handoff report in the flat, clipped language of someone reciting facts instead of feeling them, because feeling them would have to wait until later, until she was alone, until the adrenaline finally let go of her spine. Entry wound left flank, exit through the Ashworth. The trauma surgeon, a woman named Reyes, who'd worked with Sloane twice before, put a hand on her shoulder mid-sentence. "You're shaking." "I'm fine." "You're shaking. And your pressure dressing held for 6 hours in the field, which, by the way, is the reason he's still breathing right now. Go sit down." "That's an order, near enough." Sloane didn't sit down. She stood at the edge of the trauma bay instead, watching through the doorway as the team worked until someone finally pulled the curtain and told her there was nothing more for her to do here. She found a corner near the vending machines and sank down against the wall, knees pulled up, hands finally allowed to shake now that no one needed them steady. She thought about Voss's daughter. The soccer video he'd made her promise to watch a 5th time. She thought about her own father, kneeling behind her in tall grass that didn't exist anymore, on land that had probably been sold or paved over years ago, teaching a 7-year-old patience because he must have known on some level that patience was the only inheritance he'd be able to leave her. Reyes found her there 20 minutes later, mask pulled down around her neck, exhaustion and relief fighting for space on her face. "He's stable," Reyes said. "Going to need time. Going to need a lot of physical therapy, but he's going to walk his daughter down the aisle someday, assuming she doesn't decide to elope out of spite." Sloane let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding for hours. "Thank you." "Don't thank me. Your dressing bought him the 6 hours he needed." Reyes crouched down to Sloane's level, studying her with the particular clinical warmth of someone who'd spent a career reading exhausted faces. "You did good out there. Whatever else people are saying about that shot." "People are already saying things?" "People started saying things before your boots hit the tarmac." Reyes almost smiled. "Get some sleep, Ashworth. Whatever happens tomorrow, it can wait for morning." It couldn't, not really. Nothing about the last 18 years had ever been able to wait. Not the shame, not the silence, not the slow, corrosive certainty that she was the daughter of a man the whole world agreed to despise. But she nodded anyway because Reyes meant well, and because some kindnesses deserved to be accepted, even when you knew you couldn't use them. Nobody said anything on the flight back. That was the strange part. She'd expected questions, demands, somebody screaming at her about protocol, about a medic who'd picked up a sniper rifle mid-firefight and made a shot most qualified snipers wouldn't have attempted. Instead, there was silence. The kind that came after something too big to talk about yet. Corrigan sat across the aisle, helmet off, staring at her with an expression that had lost every trace of the smugness from 6 days ago. He didn't say anything either, just looked at her the way a person looks at something they thought they understood and suddenly don't. She caught his eye once, just for a second, and he looked away first. It wasn't victory, exactly, whatever passed between them in that moment. It didn't feel like winning. It felt like something heavier. Like the first stone shifting loose in a wall she'd built so carefully for so long that she'd almost convinced herself it would hold forever. Corrigan found her outside the hangar an hour later, out of his gear, hands shoved deep in his pockets like he wasn't sure what to do with them otherwise. "Hey," he said. Hey, that shot. He stopped, started again. I've seen guys train 15 years and never make that shot. Under fire, with somebody else's rifle. Wasn't planning on it being a regular thing. I said some things, Corrigan said. Before, about your dad. You said what everybody says. Doesn't make it right. He looked out at the runway lights, jaw working like the words cost him something to get out. I don't know what happened to your father, Ashworth. I don't know what really happened, and neither does anybody else on this base if I'm honest about it. We just repeat what we're told because it's easier than asking questions nobody wants to answer. Sloan looked at him for a long moment. This wasn't an apology exactly. It wasn't quite big enough for that. But it was something, and after 18 years of nothing, something counted for more than it probably should have. Thank you, she said, and meant it. He nodded once, awkward, and walked off toward the barracks without whistling this time. Kessler sat across from her, watching her with an expression she still couldn't name, and when they landed, when the rest of the team filed off toward medical and debrief and the particular exhausted silence of men who'd almost lost each other and hadn't, he stayed behind. Walk with me, he said. She walked with him, out past the hangars, past the fence line, to the same stretch of dark water where he'd found her 6 nights before. That shot, he said, not a question. I did what needed doing. That's not what I asked. He stopped walking, turned to face her fully for the first time since she'd arrived on this base. I've watched 1,000 men shoot a rifle, Ashworth. I know what natural looks like. I know what trained since birth looks like. What you did up on that ridge wasn't luck, and it wasn't adrenaline. That was muscle memory built over decades, and you're 27 years old, which means somebody started building it into you before you could walk. Sloan said nothing. I told you I saw that exact stance once before, Kessler said. You remember that? I remember. I lied about one thing. His voice dropped rough at the edges. I didn't see it a long time ago in some other war. I saw it 11 years ago. Training exercise, classified, off the books, run by a man who was supposedly already dead by then, according to every file the Navy ever printed. The night air went very still around her. Colonel Everett Ashworth, Kessler said. Your father. She hadn't heard his full name spoken out loud, not like that, not with rank attached and reverence underneath it, in longer than she could remember. Most people who said it at all said it like a slur. Kessler said it like a man saying the name of someone he still, after all these years, considered it an honor to have known. He's dead, Sloan said, and her voice cracked in a way she hated, in a way 18 years of practice hadn't managed to armor completely. He's been dead since I was 9 years old. He deserted his post and he died a coward, and that's the story, Chief. That's the whole story. Is it? That's what the file says. I don't care what the file says. Kessler's jaw was tight, his eyes bright with something that looked dangerously close to tears for a man built the way he was built. I served under men who served under your father. I heard the real stories before the official ones got written. Everett Ashworth didn't run from anything in his life. That man walked toward gunfire the way most people walk toward their own front door. Then why does every record say, because somebody wrote it that way, Kessler said. Somebody with enough rank and enough reason wrote your father out of the story he actually lived and replaced him with a coward who never existed. And I have spent 18 years wondering who and why and never having enough proof to say a word about it out loud. Sloane's hands were shaking now. Actually shaking for the first time since she'd stepped foot on this base, for the first time since a 9-year-old girl stood at a funeral with a folded flag and no body underneath it. Until tonight, Kessler said quietly. Until I watched his daughter make an impossible shot with his exact stance, his exact breathing, his exact hands. And now I'm standing here wondering what else they lied about. I need to know, Sloane said. Her voice barely made it past a whisper. I've spent my whole life being the daughter of a man who ran. Do you understand what that costs someone? Every room I walk into, every unit I get assigned to, I'm carrying his name like a debt I never took out a loan for. I know exactly what it costs, Kessler said. I watched what it did to men who served with him, good men. Some of them left the Navy over it, couldn't stomach serving under a flag that let a lie like that stand. Then help me find out the truth. Kessler was quiet a long moment, looking out at the black water like it might hand him the right words if you waited long enough. There's a man, he finally said, retired now. Used to run logistics for operations nobody wrote down in any public record. If anybody alive knows what really happened to your father 18 years ago, it's him. I haven't spoken to him in a decade. Last I heard, he wanted nothing to do with any of it. Give me a name. Not tonight. Kessler held up a hand before she could argue. You just made a shot that's going to have people asking questions come morning. Command's going to want to know where a combat medic learned to shoot like a ghost story. You go digging into classified operations from 18 years back on top of that, and you're not finding truth, Ashworth. You're finding a court-martial. I don't care about a court-martial. You should, he said, not unkindly. Because your father cared enough about something to lose everything for it, whatever that was. And I don't think you honor that by throwing away what you've built before you even know what you're fighting for. The wind came off the water the same way it always did out here. Cold, salted, patient, and Sloane Ashworth stood there in the dark with the first crack in 18 years of silence splitting wide open in front of her, and somewhere, underneath the fear, underneath the old grief she'd never let herself finish grieving, something else was waking up. Hope. Terrible, fragile hope. Because if Kessler was right, if her father hadn't been what they said he was, then somewhere in the wreckage of a story that never made sense, there might be a truth waiting for her to find it. She just didn't know yet how far she'd have to go to reach it or what it would cost the people she loved most to get there. She only knew she wasn't going to stop until she did. Behind her back, toward the barracks, a light was still on in the trauma ward where Beckett Voss lay stitched together and breathing because her hands hadn't shaken when it mattered. Somewhere out past the fence line, the same wind that carried her father's voice through 18 years of silence kept moving over the water, patient, indifferent, the way it always had. And somewhere beyond that, past oceans and borders and the careful lies of men long promoted past the reach of consequence, a truth was waiting. Sloane didn't know yet what shape it would take when she finally found it. She only knew, standing there in the dark, with Kessler's warning still hanging in the air between them, that she would not stop walking toward it. Not now. Not after tonight. Not after 18 years of carrying a name that was never truly, fully, deservedly hers to be ashamed of. For the first time since she was 9 years old, standing at a funeral with a folded flag and no body underneath it, Sloane Ashworth let herself believe that her father might still be out there somewhere, waiting. The way she had been waiting without ever letting herself admit it, for someone to finally say his name like it meant something other than shame. The name came 4 days later, not because Kessler changed his mind, because Voss woke up. Sloane sat by his hospital bed the way she'd sat by 100 other beds, except this time the numbers on the monitor belonged to a man whose daughter had sent him a soccer video, and this time she wasn't counting his pulse out of habit. She was counting it because she needed something steady to hold on to while the rest of her life came apart at the seams. "You look worse than me," Voss rasped, eyes barely open. "That's not possible. You got shot." "Feels possible." He tried to smile. It cost him. "Heard you made a hell of a shot." "Heard you're not supposed to be talking yet." "Heard a lot of things lately." His eyes found hers sharper than the morphine should have allowed. "Kessler came by. Told me some of it. Not all of it. Enough." Sloane's hands went still in her lap. "Whatever you're chasing," Voss said, voice thinning, "chase it careful. Command doesn't like ghosts walking back into the light. Makes too many people look bad." "I know." "Do you?" He closed his eyes again, breath rattling shallow. "Because I've seen careers end over smaller truths than the one I think you're circling." "What would you do," Sloane asked quietly, "if it were your father?" Voss was silent long enough that she thought he might have drifted back under. Then his eyes opened again, sharper than the morphine should have allowed. "I'd want someone in my corner who wasn't afraid of the answer," he said. "Whatever the answer turned out to be." "Is that you offering?" "That's me telling you I already am," Voss said, and closed his eyes again, done talking for now. She didn't answer. There wasn't an answer that would have made either of them feel better, and she'd learned a long time ago not to offer comfort she couldn't back up with anything real. Corrigan caught her in the hallway on her way out, hands shoved in his pockets in that same awkward way he'd stood outside the hangar days before. "You heading somewhere?" he said, not quite a question. "Just running an errand." "Ashworth." He waited until she looked at him. "Whatever this is, whatever you're chasing after, that shot after Kessler pulling you aside twice now, like the two of you are keeping a secret from the rest of us, I'm not going to ask you to tell me. But I want you to know something." "What's that?" "I was wrong about you," he said, plain, no hedging. "Wrong about your dad, too, probably, though I don't know the details and it's not my place to ask. But if you ever need someone to watch your six while you go do whatever it is you're about to go do, you've got one. That's all." Sloane looked at him a long moment, surprised by how much the offer landed, how much it mattered, coming from the same man who'd stood on the range 6 days ago, telling her what everybody said about her father. "Thank you," she said. "I mean that." "Don't get used to me being nice," Corrigan said, echoing Voss without meaning to, and something in it almost made her laugh for the first time in days. Kessler found her outside the hospital an hour later, holding a folded piece of paper like it weighed more than it should have. "Walter Pruitt," he said, handing it over. "Retired now. Lives about 2 hours inland. He ran logistics support for classified operations back when your father was still wearing a uniform. If there's a paper trail anywhere that doesn't match the official story, Pruitt's the only man alive who might still have a copy of it." "You said you hadn't talked to him in a decade." "I haven't." Something crossed Kessler's face, quick gone before she could name it. "Man cut off everybody after your father's file got closed. Stopped answering calls, stopped coming to reunions. People said grief did that to him. Some men it does. And you don't think it was grief." "I think grief and guilt look the same from the outside," Kessler said. "But only one of them keeps a man hiding for 18 years. The words landed heavier than he probably meant them to. Sloane folded the paper into her jacket pocket next to her heart, where it sat like a stone the rest of the drive home. She didn't tell anyone she was going. Not Corrigan, who'd started nodding at her in the hallways like they were something close to allies now. Not Voss, still tethered to machines that beeped his heartbeat back at him every 4 seconds. Not Command, obviously, because Command would have wanted reasons, and reasons would have led to questions, and questions would have led exactly where Voss warned her not to go. She drove 2 hours inland on a Saturday past strip malls and gas stations, and a landscape that got greener and lonelier the further she went, until the GPS finally gave up and told her she'd arrived at a house that looked like it hadn't expected visitors in a very long time. Overgrown lawn, paint peeling at the shutters, a single light on in a back window, the kind of light that meant someone was home and hoping nobody would come knock anyway. She knocked anyway. The man who opened the door was somewhere north of 70, thin in a way that looked more like erosion than age, eyes pale and wary behind glasses that needed cleaning. "Whatever you're selling," he started. "I'm not selling anything, Mr. Pruitt. My name is Sloane Ashworth." He didn't move, didn't blink, but something in his whole body went rigid, the specific rigidity of a man hearing a name he'd spent 18 years hoping never to hear again. "I don't know anyone by that name," he said, too fast, too flat. "You knew my father. I don't know anyone by that name," he said again, and started to close the door. "He didn't desert," Sloane said quick before the door could shut all the way. "Whatever they wrote in his file, I don't believe it. Master Chief Kessler doesn't believe it." "And I think you don't believe it either, Mr. Pruitt, or you wouldn't look like you just saw a ghost standing on your porch." The door stopped. Didn't open further, didn't close either. A long silence stretched between them, broken only by wind moving through the overgrown grass. "Go home," Pruitt finally said, voice cracking on the second word. Please, just go home. I can't. You have to. I don't have anywhere to go home to, Sloane said, and heard her own voice break in a way she hadn't planned. That's the whole problem, Mr. Pruitt. I grew up in a house built on a lie, with a mother who drank herself into an early grave trying to survive it, and I have spent every single day since I was 9 years old carrying a name nobody would let me be proud of. So no, I'm not going home. Not until somebody tells me the truth. Pruitt's hand tightened on the doorframe. His eyes, when they finally met hers again, were wet. Your mother, he said. She's gone 10 years now. Something broke behind his face, some old dam giving way all at once. I'm sorry, he whispered. I am so sorry. I never knew that. Nobody told me that. Why would they tell you anything? Sloane said, unless you were still close enough to someone to be told. He didn't answer that. He didn't have to. The guilt on his face answered for him, plain as anything, and Sloane felt something cold settle into her stomach that had nothing to do with the wind. Come inside, Pruitt said, finally stepping back from the door, before one of the neighbors decides to remember what I used to do for a living. The house smelled like old paper and older coffee. Pruitt led her to a back room that had clearly once been an office, now more of a shrine to a career he'd apparently spent 2 decades trying to bury under dust and disuse. Filing cabinets, a desk with nothing on it, a single photograph, framed, turned face down on a shelf. Sloane's eyes went to it immediately. Don't, Pruitt said, following her gaze. Not yet. Who is it? He sat down heavily in a chair that groaned under him, older than he was probably, and rubbed both hands over his face like he was trying to wipe away 18 years in a single gesture. Sloane waited, watching the old man's hands tremble against his own cheeks, and understood somehow before he said another word that whatever picture lay turned against that shelf had been facing away for a very long time. Not out of forgetting, out of something closer to penance. She'd seen that particular posture before, in mirrors, in her own reflection, on mornings after nightmares she never talked about. Guilt, she was learning, wore the same shape no matter whose shoulders carried it. That's him, Pruitt finally said, nodding toward the frame without looking at it directly. Taken, the week before everything changed. I turned it around the day I heard the word desertion attached to his name because I couldn't stand to look at his face knowing what I was about to let stand. Some cowardice you learn to live with by simply refusing to see it. Your father saved my life, he said. Not metaphorically, actually. A logistics convoy I was running got ambushed on a supply route nobody was supposed to know about, and Everett Ashworth walked back into that fire alone to pull me out when every rational calculation said to leave me. He carried me 2 miles on a busted ankle. Mine, not his. Sloane's throat tightened. I never heard that story. Nobody ever heard that story. Because the story that got written afterward wasn't about heroism. It was about a man who supposedly ran from his post 8 months later, and once that story got written, nobody wanted to be caught telling a different one. What actually happened 8 months later? Pruitt was quiet a long moment. Long enough that Sloane thought he might not answer at all, might simply sit there, letting the silence do what silence had done for 18 years, protect him, and bury her father a second time. Your father found something, he finally said, in the logistics manifests. Discrepancies. Equipment listed as destroyed that was actually being diverted. Weapons, ammunition, high-grade components that should have gone to decommissioning and instead went somewhere else entirely. Diverted where? I don't know all of it. I knew enough to be afraid of it. Pruitt's hands were shaking now, an old man's tremor made worse by whatever memory was moving through him. He brought it to me because I ran logistics, asked me to help him trace the paperwork back to whoever was authorizing it. And I did, because he was my friend and because I owed him my life, and because I was young enough back then to believe the truth mattered more than the people it might destroy. Who was authorizing it? Pruitt looked at her, and something in his face had gone gray, the color of a man about to say something he'd spent 2 decades trying not to say out loud. A name that outranked both of us by a mile, he said. A name that's still in uniform today. Still climbing. Still exactly as untouchable now as it was then. Sloane's pulse was loud in her own ears. Tell me. Not yet. Pruitt held up a hand, and for the first time since she'd walked in, there was something almost like fear in his eyes that wasn't about her. Because the moment I say it out loud, there's no taking it back. And I need you to understand what happened to your father before I hand you a name that might get you buried right next to whatever they did to him. You're saying he might still be— I'm saying I don't know, Pruitt said, too quickly, and Sloane caught the lie the way she'd learned to catch every lie in her life, by the small tell of a man looking anywhere but directly at her. I'm saying the official record says he deserted and died somewhere unrecoverable, and I'm saying official records get written by people with something to protect. He told her the rest slowly, like a man diffusing something that might still go off in his hands. Everett Ashworth had taken what he found to a superior officer he trusted. Within a week, he'd been reassigned to a classified operation with almost no notice, no explanation. Orders that came down from high enough that nobody below a certain rank was allowed to ask questions about them. He never came back from that operation. The official story said desertion. Said he'd abandoned his post under fire, left men exposed, disappeared rather than face consequences for a failure of nerve. Nobody who knew him actually believed. The unofficial story, the one that lived only in the quiet, guilty corners of men like Pruitt and Kessler, said something else entirely. Said he'd been sent somewhere specifically designed to make sure he never came back to testify about what he'd found. And you knew this, Sloane said. Her voice had gone very flat, very controlled, the particular calm she reserved for moments when feeling anything at all would have been too dangerous to survive. You knew this for 18 years? And you let my mother believe he was a coward. You let me grow up believing it. I was afraid. I was 9, I know. Pruitt's voice cracked completely now, the last of whatever composure he'd been holding finally giving way. I know. And there is no version of this where I get to say that fear is a good enough excuse, but it's the only one I have. I was young, and I was scared, and by the time I was old enough to be braver than that, too much time had passed, and I didn't know how to walk back into your life and tell you the truth without also telling you I was a coward who let a lie stand for a decade because I valued my own pension over your father's name. Silence. The kind that had weight to it. The kind that sat in the room like a third person nobody wanted to acknowledge. There's something else, Pruitt said, quiet now, almost too quiet to hear. Sloane looked up some old instinct telling her whatever came next would matter more than everything he'd said so far. Your father wrote letters, he said, before that last operation. He didn't know for certain what was coming, but he wasn't a fool either. He knew the ground he was standing on had gotten dangerous. So he wrote 18 letters, one for every year until you turned an adult, plus a few more, just in case. Gave them to me to deliver, one a year, so you'd always have something from him, even if he never came home to explain the rest. Sloane's whole body had gone still, the specific stillness of someone standing at the edge of something enormous. You never sent them, she said, not a question. I couldn't. Pruitt's hands were shaking harder now. Every year I told myself, this year I'll send it. I'll find a way to explain why it's late. And every year the fear won. Because sending even one letter meant admitting I had them. And admitting I had them meant admitting I'd been lying to your mother, to you, to everyone for exactly as long as I'd stayed quiet. Where are they? Pruitt stood, unsteady, and walked to the filing cabinet in the corner, pulled a drawer that stuck, then gave way with a metal groan. Reached into the back past folders that meant nothing until his hand closed around a wooden box, small, plain. The kind of box that could have held anything, and instead held 18 years of a father's voice nobody had ever been allowed to hear. He set it on the desk between them like it might detonate. I'm sorry, he said again. I know it doesn't fix anything. I know sorry is the cheapest thing I could possibly offer you after everything I let stand. But it's what I have. Sloane reached for the box with hands that weren't quite steady anymore. She read the first letter in the car parked outside Pruitt's overgrown lawn engine, off hands trembling around paper that had waited 18 years to be opened. My dearest Sloan girl, if you're reading this, it means I'm not there to read it to you myself. And I am so sorry for that, sweetheart. I am so sorry. I want you to know something, and I need you to hold on to it no matter what anyone ever tells you about me. You are the best thing I ever did in this life. Better than any medal, any mission, any version of myself I ever tried to be for my country. You. I taught you to shoot because I needed you to be able to protect yourself in a world I might not always be there to protect you from. I never taught you to hurt anyone. I taught you to be still, to be patient, to wait for the moment that matters instead of wasting yourself on the moments that don't. Whatever they tell you happened to me, whatever story ends up written down somewhere official, I need you to know this. I never ran from anything in my life. Not once. Not from danger, and not from you, and not from the truth, even when the truth got dangerous to hold. I love you more than I ever found the words to say out loud. I hope wherever I end up, I get the chance to say it to your face at least once more. Your father, always. Sloan sat in the car for a long time after she finished reading, tears she hadn't let herself cry in 10 years, finally breaking loose all at once. The box of 17 more letters sitting on the passenger seat like a door she'd only just started to open. She didn't sleep that night. Read every letter, one after another, watching a man she barely remembered come alive again on paper, watching him guess at birthdays and graduations and heartbreaks he'd never been there to witness, watching him love her across 18 years of silence with nothing but pen and paper and a hope that someone would eventually be brave enough to deliver it. The last letter was different, shorter, written in a hand that looked hurried, urgent, like a man who knew his time to write was running out. Sloan, if this is the one you're reading, something has gone very wrong, and I need you to understand it wasn't an accident. What I found wasn't a mistake I stumbled into, it was a decision someone made. Someone with enough rank to make problems disappear instead of answering for them. I'm not asking you to avenge me. I'm asking you to be careful because whoever did this to me is still out there, and men like that don't stop being dangerous just because time passes. If there's ever a chance to know the truth, take it. But take it slowly. Take it smart. Don't let anger make you reckless the way it almost made me reckless once. Slow is smooth. Smooth is fast. You remember that, don't you, baby girl? I love you. I have always loved you. No file, no lie, no cowardly silence from anyone who should have told you sooner changes that. Sloan read it 3 times before she finally set it down. She went back to Pruitt 2 days later, found him waiting at the door, like he'd known she would come, like 18 years of guilt had finally found its ending point and he was ready at last to walk through it. The name, she said. No preamble, no patience left for preamble. Pruitt exhaled long and slow, the exhale of a man setting down a weight he'd carried so long it had become part of his spine. Admiral Grant Holloway, he said. The name landed in Sloan's chest like a physical blow, because she knew that name. Everyone on her base knew that name. Admiral Holloway, who'd visited Task Unit Cormorant's headquarters twice since she'd been stationed there, who shook hands and smiled for photographs and spoke about honor and legacy in a voice that carried real weight with real men who genuinely respected him. He commands half the operations on the eastern seaboard, Sloan said, her voice barely above a whisper. He commands considerably more than that now, Pruitt said. And he has spent 18 years making very sure nobody with proof ever got close enough to matter. Is my father still alive? Pruitt's face did something complicated, grief and fear, and something that might have been hope, all fighting for space at once. I don't know for certain, he said, but 6 years ago I heard something. A rumor, nothing more, passed through a friend of a friend who used to work logistics on a black site detention program. A prisoner held under a designation nobody was supposed to ask questions about. American, older, kept alive for reasons nobody down the chain was cleared to understand. Sloane's whole body had gone electric. Every nerve lit up at once. "Where?" she said. "I don't know where. I only know it exists, or existed, and that the man who could tell you for certain whether it's your father is the same man who put him there in the first place." Holloway. Sloane stood in Pruitt's doorway with 18 letters in a box under her arm and a name in her chest that felt like it might actually kill her to carry, and she understood for the first time since Kessler sat down next to her on that overturned crate exactly how far this was going to go, and exactly how dangerous it was about to become. Because the man who buried her father wasn't some faceless name in a file. He was standing in photographs on the wall of her own headquarters, shaking hands with the very people she served beside every single day. She didn't go straight back to base, drove instead to the one place she'd been avoiding for 10 years without ever admitting that's what she was doing. The small brick house 2 streets from where she grew up, the one that still had a name on the mailbox she recognized. Gordon Halstead had been her mother's closest friend since before Sloane was born. The man who showed up every year on the anniversary of her father's disappearance with flowers nobody asked him to bring. The man who sat with her mother through the worst of the drinking, who paid for the funeral when there was no money left to pay for it, who'd shown up at every birthday, every graduation, every hard year since, filling a space in Sloane's life that her father's absence had carved out and never filled. She loved him. She trusted him more than almost anyone alive. Which was exactly why what happened next broke something in her she wasn't sure would ever fully heal. He answered the door with the same warm smile he always had, the one that made her feel 9 years old again in the best possible way. The one that had been the closest thing to a father's love she'd had for 18 years. "Sloane, girl," he said, using the exact words her father used in every single letter, and something cold moved through her chest before her brain had even caught up to why. "Uncle Gordon," she said carefully, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth." His smile faltered, just slightly, just enough. "Of course," he said. "Anything." "Did you know Admiral Holloway before he was an admiral?" The silence that followed lasted only 3 seconds. It felt like 3 years. "Sloane," he started. "Did you know him?" she said again, louder this time. "Before he was an admiral, Gordon, yes or no?" His face did something she had never seen it do in 18 years of birthdays and holidays and quiet, steady kindness. It closed. Shut down completely, the warmth draining out of it like water from a cracked glass replaced by something gray and old and desperately tired. "Come inside," he said. "Please. Let me explain before you decide to hate me." And Sloane, standing on a porch she'd stood on 100 times before, felt the last solid ground under her feet give way completely, because the man who'd spent 18 years being the closest thing to family she had left was about to tell her he'd been part of destroying the family she was supposed to have all along. The living room hadn't changed in years. Same worn couch, same photographs on the mantel, her mother laughing at some barbecue Sloane barely remembered, Sloane herself at 7, at 12, at a college graduation Gordon had attended when nobody else on her father's side of the family bothered to show. He sat across from her now, with his hands clasped so tight the knuckles had gone white, and for the first time in her entire life, Sloane looked at Gordon Halstead and saw a stranger. "I need you to understand something before I say anything else," he began. "Everything I did after your father disappeared, I did because I loved you and your mother. That part was never a lie." "Start at the beginning," Sloane said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Not the part where you decided you loved us, the part where you decided to help bury my father." Gordon flinched, like she'd struck him. "I didn't help bury him," he said. "I helped bury the truth. There's a difference, even if it doesn't feel like one to you right now." "Explain the difference." He was quiet a long moment, eyes fixed on some point past her shoulder somewhere in the past neither of them could reach anymore. "I worked personnel records," he said. "Not logistics like Pruitt. Records. I processed the paperwork after operations closed out, wrote up final statuses, filed the reports that went into permanent record. A breath, shaky. When your father's operation went dark, I was the one who received the closing report from command. And the report I received didn't say desertion. It said, missing status unknown pending further investigation. Then how did desertion end up the official story? Because 3 days later, a different report came down, Gordon said, signed by an officer several ranks above anyone I answered to. It overrode the first one, called it desertion under fire, ordered the file closed, no further investigation, no further inquiry from anyone below flag rank. Holloway. Gordon nodded, barely like even the motion cost him something. I knew it was wrong, he said. I knew missing status doesn't get overridden like that without someone very high up wanting it overridden, but I was 26 years old, Sloan, and I had a mortgage and a wife who was sick and a career I'd worked too hard for to throw away asking questions nobody wanted asked. So I filed the report the way I was told to file it. And I told myself it wasn't my lie. I was just following orders. And then your mother needed someone, Gordon said, and for the first time his composure cracked, fully voice breaking apart at the seams. She was alone, and she was drowning, and I told myself that showing up for her, being there for you, was how I made up for what I'd done. I told myself the kindness could balance the silence. It doesn't, Sloan said, quiet, flat, devastating. It never did. You just made the silence more comfortable to live inside. Gordon's eyes filled, spilled over, and he didn't wipe them away. I know that now. I think some part of me has known it for 18 years. Silence stretched between them, heavy, unbearable, filled with everything neither of them knew how to say. Did you know about the letters? Sloan finally asked. Pruitt's letters. Gordon's head came up sharply. What letters? And something in his shock, genuine, unrehearsed, told her at least this much was true. He hadn't known. Whatever guilt he carried, it wasn't the same guilt as Pruitt's. My father wrote me 18 letters before he disappeared, Sloan said. Gave them to Pruitt to send one a year. Pruitt never sent them. Kept them in a box in a filing cabinet for 18 years because he was too afraid of what sending them would mean. Gordon's face crumpled entirely. All this time, he whispered. All this time I thought I was the only one carrying it. I thought if I just kept showing up, kept being here for you and your mother, I was doing something to balance what I owed. And there was a box sitting 2 hours away the whole time with his voice in it, and neither of us ever told the other. Tell me about Holloway, Sloan said. Everything, all of it. I don't have room left for gentle. Gordon nodded, wiped his face with the back of one trembling hand, and began. Holloway hadn't always been an admiral. Back when Everett Ashworth found the discrepancies in the logistics manifests, Holloway had been a captain, ambitious, well-connected, already being spoken of in certain circles as a man destined for flag rank. The diversion program Everett uncovered, weapons and equipment quietly funneled outside official channels, had been Holloway's operation from the start, run through a network of contractors and shell logistics companies that made everything look clean on paper, while turning a quiet, considerable profit for the men at the top of it. Everett had taken his findings up the chain the way procedure demanded. What he hadn't known, what nobody could have known without already being inside the corruption, was that the chain led directly back to Holloway himself. Within a week, Everett was reassigned. Classified operation, minimal briefing, orders that came down from high enough that nobody questioned them. He never came back. I processed the aftermath, Gordon said. I saw the paperwork Holloway generated to close the file. I saw how carefully it was worded. Desertion, no body recovered. Case closed, no further inquiry. His hands were shaking badly now. I told myself for years that maybe it really was desertion, that maybe Everett had simply run and everything else was coincidence. It was easier to believe than the alternative. When did you stop believing that? The day I found out you were being deployed with Task Unit Cormorant, Gordon said. The same unit Holloway personally reviews twice a year. The same base he visits for photographs and speeches about honor. I told myself it was a coincidence. I have told myself that every single day since, and I have never once believed it.
Sloane's blood went cold. You think it's deliberate? She said. You think he had me assigned there on purpose?
I think Admiral Holloway has spent 18 years making very sure nobody gets close enough to the truth to matter, Gordon said. And I think a young medic with your father's exact skill set showing up at a base he personally oversees is either the most dangerous coincidence in the world or it isn't a coincidence at all.
The room felt smaller suddenly, the walls pressing closer, every photograph on the mantel watching her with her mother's laughing eyes. Is my father alive? Sloane asked the question she'd been circling since Pruitt first said the word rumor 2 days ago.
I don't know, Gordon said. But I know Holloway has spent almost 2 decades protecting something specific enough that he's never let the file fully close.
Men like that don't guard graves that carefully, Sloane. They guard secrets that can still talk.
She left Gordon's house an hour later with a promise from him that he'd help however he could, whatever that ended up meaning, and a warning that chased her the whole drive back to base. Be careful who you tell, he'd said at the door, gripping her arm with more strength than she expected from a man his age.
If Holloway finds out you're asking questions before you have proof strong enough to protect yourself with, he won't hesitate. Whatever he did to your father, he'll do worse to make sure it stays buried.
She thought about those words the entire drive back, thought about them while she sat parked outside the base gate for 20 minutes before finally going in, thought about them while she lay awake that night staring at a box of letters she'd hidden at the bottom of her footlocker, like contraband.
Because that's what it was now, wasn't it? Contraband, evidence, a truth dangerous enough that the people who loved her most had spent 18 years too afraid to hand it over. Kessler noticed the difference in her immediately. 2 days after Gordon's confession, he found her at the aid station long after her shift ended, staring at nothing, hands wrapped around cold coffee she hadn't touched.
You look like someone who found something they wish they hadn't, he said.
I found a name. Kessler went very still. Holloway.
Sloane's head snapped up.
You knew!
I suspected, Kessler said, for years. Never had proof strong enough to say it out loud. And saying a name like that without proof is a fast way to end up discredited, reassigned, or worse.
I was waiting for something solid enough to act on.
I have letters, Sloane said. My father's handwriting. I have a witness who processed the falsified reports. I have a rumor about a black site detention program that might still be holding him. Kessler's face went through several things at once. Hope, fear, something that looked almost like grief for time already lost.
That's not nothing, he said slowly.
But it's not enough either. Not to move against a man with Holloway's rank and Holloway's reach. You move too early, you don't just fail, you disappear. The same way your father did, except this time, there won't be a daughter left behind to keep asking questions.
So what do I do? You build the case quietly, Kessler said. You find out where that detention program is, if it still exists. You find people willing to testify, who Holloway can't simply erase. And you do all of it without him knowing you're doing it, because the moment he knows, the clock starts, and I promise you, Ashworth, that clock runs faster than you think. How do I even start looking for a black site nobody's supposed to know exists? Kessler was quiet a moment, weighing something behind his eyes.
There are men who worked adjacent to programs like that, contractors mostly, civilians who saw pieces of things they were never supposed to see and kept their mouths shut because keeping quiet paid better than talking.
If Pruitt heard a rumor, there's a chain of people behind that rumor. Somebody talked to somebody who talked to Pruitt's friend. You start pulling that thread careful, one knot at a time, and eventually it leads somewhere real.
That could take months. It could take years, Kessler said, not unkindly. Patience worn into every syllable the way only decades of hard-earned experience can wear it.
Truth buried this deep doesn't come up fast just because you're in a hurry to find it. I know that's not what you want to hear. But rushing gets people killed, Ashworth, and I've already buried enough people I care about because they moved too fast toward something too dangerous.
Sloane thought of the letters sitting in her footlocker. Thought of her father's careful, patient handwriting telling her the same thing in 100 different ways across 18 years.
Slow is smooth. Smooth is fast. Okay, she said finally. Slow, careful, but we start now. We start now, Kessler agreed. That night, Sloane sat on her bunk with the box of letters open in her lap, reading her father's words for what felt like the 100th time, searching each line, now not just for comfort but for clues, for anything that might point toward where a man could be hidden for 18 years without anyone finding him. She found it in the second-to-last letter, a line she'd read past too quickly the first time, too overwhelmed by grief to notice its shape. If anything ever happens, and you go looking for answers, remember the fishing trip. Remember the cabin. Remember what I always told you about the third ridge past the tree line. That's where I'd go if I ever needed somewhere nobody would think to look. Sloane sat up straight, heart hammering. The cabin. A place from her childhood, barely remembered, a week every summer before everything fell apart, a stretch of wilderness 2 states away that her father used to call the only honest place left in the country. Not a message about the past, a message about the future, about where to look if she ever needed to. She didn't sleep at all that night, just sat there with the letter in her hands, the last of her father's careful, deliberate love laid out in ink, and understood finally completely that the truth wasn't just waiting to be found. It was waiting for her, specifically, to be brave enough to go find it. 3 days later, an envelope arrived at the base with no return address. Plain white. No postmark she recognized, no sender information anywhere on its surface, just her name typed in a font that gave away nothing about the person who'd typed it. Sloane almost didn't open it there in the mailroom, surrounded by other soldiers picking through care packages and bills and letters from home. Some instinct, old and sharp, told her whatever waited inside deserved privacy. But her hands were already tearing the seal before her better judgment caught up, and by the time she registered what she was looking at, it was too late to unsee it. A single photograph, grainy, old, clearly taken from a distance with a long lens. A man, older, thinner than she remembered, standing in what looked like a fenced compound somewhere with mountains behind it. His face was turned slightly away, but something in the set of his shoulders, the particular way he stood with his weight balanced, patient still, made Sloane's whole body go numb with recognition. She knew that stance. She'd know it anywhere, in any lighting, at any age. It was the same stance he'd taught her behind a rifle in tall grass 2 decades ago. The same patience. The same stillness. No note. No explanation, just the photograph, and on the back, in handwriting she didn't recognize, 6 words that would change everything. He's alive. He's waiting. Hurry. Sloane stood in the mailroom with the photograph shaking in her hands, and somewhere behind her, unnoticed, unremarked, a figure in an officer's uniform paused just long enough at the doorway to see exactly what she was holding before continuing on down the hall like nothing at all had happened. She didn't see him. She wouldn't know until much later how much that single careless moment was about to cost her. Wouldn't know that the pause had lasted exactly 4 seconds. Wouldn't know that 4 seconds was more than enough time for a trained eye to recognize a grainy photograph for exactly what it was, and to understand, with a cold and practiced certainty, precisely who needed to hear about it by morning. But for now, for this one suspended breath of time, all she could feel was her father's voice from 18 years of silence finally breaking through. He's alive. She read the words again. He's alive. He's waiting. Hurry. 6 words, and somehow they carried more weight than every letter in the box combined, because letters were the past, careful and composed, written by a man with time enough to choose his sentences. This was the present. Someone, somewhere, wanted her to know right now, today, that the wait might finally be ending. She thought of Kessler's warning about the clock, thought of Pruitt's trembling hands and Gordon's crumpled, guilty face, thought of her father's voice telling her again and again across 18 years of silence to be smooth, to be patient, to wait for the moment that mattered instead of wasting herself on the moments that didn't. She thought too of Voss, lying in that hospital bed, telling her he was already in her corner, whatever the answer turned out to be. Of Corrigan, outside the hangar, awkward and sincere, offering to watch her back without being asked. Of a support system quietly assembling itself around her piece by piece the way it never had in 18 years of carrying this alone. Maybe that was the part her father couldn't have known when he wrote those letters. That the daughter he'd been forced to leave behind wouldn't have to walk this final stretch by herself after all. That she was already deciding, standing there with proof trembling in her hands, that nothing on this earth was going to stop her from bringing him home. The summons came at 0600, delivered by a yeoman who wouldn't meet her eyes. "Admiral Holloway wants to see you. Personally, this morning." Sloane stood in her quarters, holding the note like it might bite her heart, hammering so hard she was sure the yeoman must have heard it. Because there was only one reason a 2-star admiral requested a private audience with a contract medic. Because the man at the doorway in the mailroom hadn't been careless after all. Because 4 seconds had apparently been more than enough. She thought about running, thought about it for exactly as long as it took to remember her father's voice in 18 years of letters telling her not to be reckless, and then she squared her shoulders and walked toward whatever was waiting for her. Because hiding had never once been something an Ashworth knew how to do well. Her hands weren't shaking when she dressed that morning. That surprised her more than anything else. 18 years of practice apparently had taught her body exactly how to stand still even when everything underneath the stillness was screaming. She thought of Pruitt's trembling hands, of Gordon's crumpled face on that porch, of every man in this story so far who'd let fear decide what he did next. And she made herself a quiet promise, walking across the base in the gray early light, that whatever happened in that office, she wasn't going to become one more person this story swallowed whole. Corrigan fell into step beside her halfway across the yard, uniform, crisp, expression tight. "Word travels fast," he said. "Too fast. You want me to come with you?" "No." She stopped walking long enough to look at him properly. "If this goes wrong, I need you and Kessler on the outside, not standing next to me when it happens." Corrigan's jaw worked, weighing the order against everything in him that wanted to argue. "Copy that," he said finally. "But if you're not out in 20 minutes, I'm coming in." "Deal." Holloway's office looked exactly like the photographs. Flags, medals in glass cases, a man behind a desk with silver hair and a handshake reputation built on decades of careful, deliberate charm. Dr. Ashworth. He didn't stand. Didn't smile, either. Not the practiced photograph smile she'd seen twice before at base functions. "Sit down." She sat. "I understand you've been asking questions," Holloway said. No preamble, no warmth, just the flat, patient tone of a man who'd buried harder problems than her before breakfast. "About operations that closed out before you were old enough to drive?" "Have I?" "Don't." His eyes were pale, unblinking, the eyes of a man who'd learned long ago that stillness intimidated better than shouting ever could. "I've spent 30 years reading people, Doctor. I know exactly what you've been doing, and I know exactly why, and I want you to understand something before this conversation goes any further." "I'm listening." "Your father was a good officer," Holloway said, and something in the careful neutrality of it made Sloane's skin crawl. "Talented. Respected. Unfortunately, talented men sometimes convince themselves they're owed the truth about things far above their clearance. That conviction cost him everything. I would hate to see it cost his daughter the same." "Is that a threat, Admiral?" "It's advice." He finally leaned back, folding his hands. "You have a promising career ahead of you. Command respects your work. I'd hate for old, closed history to derail something you've built with your own 2 hands. Sloane held his gaze, and something inside her, patient and still and entirely her father's, refused to look away first. "With respect, sir," she said, "I don't think you called me in here to give me career advice." Holloway's expression didn't change, not visibly, but something behind his eyes went colder, sharper, the mask slipping just enough for her to glimpse what lived underneath it. "You're very much like him, you know," he said, almost conversationally. The same stillness, the same refusal to be the first one to blink. I remember that about your father. It's what made him so dangerous and so easy to underestimate. Is that why you had him buried instead of promoted? The words hung in the air between them, sharper than she'd intended, and for one bright, dangerous second, something flickered across Holloway's face that looked almost like fear.
I don't know what you think you know, Doctor, he said, voice carefully even again. But I'd think very hard about repeating theories you can't prove to people who might not survive hearing them. Go back to work, Dr. Ashworth, he said quietly. Let old ghosts stay buried. That's the only advice I have for you today. She stood because there was nothing left to say that wouldn't hand him more than she wanted him to have, and walked out of that office with her spine straight and her hands shaking only once she was safely around the corner.
Because that was the moment she understood, standing in an empty hallway with her pulse hammering in her ears, that Holloway hadn't summoned her to warn her off. He'd summoned her to measure exactly how much of a threat she'd become. And whatever he'd seen in her face during that conversation, she had the distinct, chilling sense it hadn't reassured him at all. He knows, she told Kessler an hour later, voice low, both of them standing in the shadow of the aid station where nobody could overhear. He didn't say it outright, but he knows. Kessler's expression hardened. Then the clock I warned you about just started running. So what do? We stop being careful and start being fast, Kessler said. Because a man like Holloway doesn't threaten people he isn't already planning to remove. You have maybe days before he decides you're more dangerous alive than the paperwork trail he'd have to clean up if you disappeared too. Sloane's stomach dropped. You think he'd actually— I think he already did it once, Kessler said. To your father. To a decorated colonel with a wife and a 9-year-old daughter and 30 witnesses who respected him. You think a contract medic with no rank and no protection is safer than that? She didn't have an answer. She didn't need one. The look on Kessler's face gave her the answer already. Then we move, she said. Tonight, if we have to. Not tonight, Kessler said. Tomorrow. Tonight we plan because rushing into this half-blind gets people killed, and I am not writing a second Ashworth into a closed file this decade. Fair enough. And Sloane. It was the first time he'd used her given name instead of her surname since she'd arrived on this base, and something about the shift in it landed harder than she expected. Whatever happens from here, you didn't do this alone. You understand that whatever gets written down after tonight, it gets written down about all of us. She nodded, throat too tight for words, and together they walked back toward the barracks to start building something out of 18 years of silence that no admiral was going to be able to bury a second time. The cabin sat exactly where the letter said it would, tucked into a fold of mountains 2 states away, reachable only by a dirt road that hadn't seen maintenance in years. Sloane drove through the night to get there, Corrigan in the passenger seat because he'd refused to let her go alone. Kessler following 20 minutes behind in a separate vehicle because 3 people traveling together drew less attention, split into 2 cars than 1. The cabin was smaller than she remembered, dust everywhere, furniture draped in sheets like ghosts waiting patiently for someone to finally come home. She stood in the doorway a long moment before stepping inside, memory rushing up to meet her all at once. Summers. Fishing poles leaned against the porch rail. Her father's laugh, deep and easy in a way she'd almost forgotten a man like him was capable of laughing. "You okay?" Corrigan asked quietly, watching her from the doorway. "I don't know yet," she admitted. "Ask me again once we've found what we're looking for." "Third ridge past the tree line," she murmured, remembering her father's letter, and led Corrigan out the back door into pine-dark woods that smelled exactly the way they had when she was 7 years old and didn't yet understand what any of the lessons were for. They found the cache an hour later, buried under a flat stone her father had once shown her how to identify, 3 notches cut into the granite, invisible unless you knew exactly what you were looking at. A waterproof case. Inside more paper, maps, coordinates, a logistics manifest with Holloway's authorization signature circled in red ink, the same signature Pruitt had described, the same corruption Everett Ashworth had died trying to expose.
Sloane's hands trembled as she spread the papers across a fallen log. Corrigan crouched beside her, holding a flashlight steady while she read.
He knew, she whispered. He knew this might happen. He prepared for it piece by piece for years, and nobody ever thought to look here because nobody remembered this place existed except me.
Lucky he had a daughter with a good memory, Corrigan said.
Lucky he had a daughter he trusted enough to leave it with.
And one more thing. A single coordinate, handwritten, no explanation attached.
Corrigan read it out loud while Sloane stared at the paper with her whole body gone electric. That's not in the States, Corrigan said slowly. That's overseas.
Remote. Mountainous from the terrain markers. He looked up at her. Ashworth, I think this is where they're keeping him. Sloane sat back on her heels in the dark, pine needles pressing into her knees, and felt 18 years of grief and hope collide inside her chest all at once.
Then that's where we're going, she said.
Kessler made the calls that mattered. Old favors, older friendships, men who owed him things they'd never fully be able to repay. Within 36 hours, they had confirmation, a black site detention facility officially decommissioned on paper years ago, still quietly operational under a designation buried 3 layers deep in classified budget lines that Holloway personally controlled.
Nobody sanctioned this program in over a decade, Kessler told her, spreading intelligence reports across the hood of his truck at a rest stop 2 hours from base, voice low, even though nobody else was around to hear. Which means whoever's still running it is running it entirely on Holloway's authority, off every book that matters. If your father's there, he's been kept alive this whole time for exactly one reason.
What reason? Leverage, Kessler said, in case anyone ever got close enough to threaten Holloway with real proof. A living witness is dangerous to kill outright. Too many questions, too much risk. But a living witness kept quiet, kept controlled, kept just barely alive enough to produce if needed as a bargaining chip. That's a insurance policy. A man like Holloway would keep paying premiums on for as long as it took.
Sloane's stomach turned at the calculation of it. The coldness, the sheer bureaucratic cruelty of treating a human life like a line item on a risk ledger.
Then we get him out, she said. However we have to. However we have to, Kessler agreed, folding the maps back together. But understand what that means, Ashworth. This isn't a training exercise. If we're wrong about the security posture, if we're wrong about the numbers, people don't come home from this. That includes you. I know. Do you? He studied her hard, the same way he had that first night by the water. Because there's a difference between being willing to die for something and being ready to. I need you ready, not just willing. Sloane thought about her father's letters about a girl who'd spent 18 years being ashamed of a name that was never hers to be ashamed of, about a truth finally close enough to touch. I'm ready, she said, and meant it more completely than she'd ever meant anything in her life. This isn't an authorized op, Voss said, sitting up in his hospital bed against doctor's orders, voice still weak but eyes sharp as ever.
You understand that. If you go without command backing, no air support, no extraction guarantee. If it goes wrong, there's no one coming to pull you out.
I understand, Sloane said.
And if it goes right, Voss continued, you're bringing home a man the United States government officially decided didn't exist 18 years ago, exposing an admiral in the process, which means half of command is going to want this to have never happened at all.
I understand that too. Voss studied her for a long moment, something like pride fighting through the exhaustion on his face. You could lose everything doing this, he said. Your career, your clearance, possibly your freedom, if the wrong people decide to make an example out of you instead of Holloway. I know. And you're going anyway?
He's my father, Sloane said simply. I spent 18 years being ashamed of a man who was never anything but brave. I'm not spending one more day letting that lie stand while I have the chance to fix it.
Voss was quiet a moment, studying her the way a commander studies someone he's about to trust with something enormous.
Then God help whoever's guarding that fence line, he said. because they have no idea what's about to walk through it. He reached for a folder on his bedside table, pulled it open, revealed maps and notes he'd apparently been assembling since Kessler first briefed him. I can't authorize this, but I can tell you everything I know about the region, the likely security posture, and the fastest routes in and out. Unofficially, off the record. Why would you risk that? Because you packed a wound in a war zone with your bare hands and kept me talking about my daughter until the bird came, Voss said. I don't forget things like that, Ashworth. Not ever. They went in 4 days later, Sloan, Kessler, Corrigan, and 2 of Kessler's old contacts who'd spent careers doing exactly this kind of work off the books for exactly this kind of reason. The flight in was quiet. Nobody spoke much, each of them lost in whatever private calculations soldiers make before doing something that can't be undone. Sloan spent most of it with her father's letters pressed flat against her chest, inside her jacket, reading his handwriting from memory in the dark, because she'd read them so many times now the words had become something closer to a heartbeat than language. Corrigan sat across from her, checking his gear methodically, the same habit she'd seen from him 100 times now, the particular ritual soldiers develop to keep their hands busy while their minds prepare for whatever comes next. You scared? He asked quietly, not looking up from his rifle. Terrified, she admitted. You, every time, he said. Anybody who tells you they're not, lying to you or to themselves. He finally looked up, meeting her eyes. For what it's worth, I've never felt better about who's covering my back. Same, she said, and meant it more than the 2 simple words could carry. The facility sat low against a mountainside, unremarkable from a distance, fencing and floodlights the only clue that anything inside mattered enough to guard. Sloan lay on her stomach on a ridge 600 yards out, scope, steady breathing the way her father taught her before she was old enough to understand why. In for 4. Because if this went wrong, it wouldn't just be her life on the line. It would be the last chance anyone ever got to bring Everett Ashworth home. Hold for 4. Because 18 years of silence had led to exactly this moment, this ridge, this rifle, and there was no version of tonight where she allowed herself to be anything less than perfectly still. Out for 4. The first guard went down without a sound. The second followed 12 seconds later. Kessler's team moved through the gap in the fence with the quiet, practiced efficiency of men who'd done this before, more times than they'd ever be allowed to talk about, and Sloan came down off the ridge with her medical kit slung tight against her back, heart pounding louder than she'd ever admit to anyone. Radio silence, hand signals only. Corrigan on point, moving low along the perimeter wall, checking corners with the same discipline he'd shown that first night in the mountains months ago, back when he still thought she was just a medic who didn't belong in his world. He belonged in hers now. She understood that, watching him move, watching the trust between them operate wordlessly the way it only ever did between people who'd already bled for each other once. Clear. He breathed into the dark, and they pushed forward together toward the low concrete building at the center of the compound. The cell block smelled like concrete and old fear. Sloan moved down the corridor behind Corrigan, checking door after door, each one empty, each one hollow with the particular silence of a place that had swallowed people whole and never given them back. Her heart climbed higher with every door that turned up empty, fear starting to whisper the possibility she'd refused to let herself consider, that they were too late, that the coordinate had led them somewhere he'd already been moved from, or worse. The last door opened onto a small room, a cot, a single chair, a man sitting hunched in the corner, thinner than any photograph could have prepared her for, hair gone entirely white, hands trembling in his lap. He looked up. For one long, suspended moment, neither of them moved, neither of them breathed. Sloan! His voice cracked on her name, disbelieving, like a man afraid he'd finally lost his mind after 18 years of hoping. Dad! The word broke apart in her mouth, 18 years of longing collapsing into a single syllable. Dad, it's me. He tried to stand, couldn't. His legs gave out beneath him, and Sloan was across the room before she registered moving, catching him, holding him, both of them sinking to the floor together,
while 18 years of silence finally broke wide open between them. "You found me," he whispered into her hair, sobbing in a way she'd never once seen a man like him allow himself to sob. "Sloane girl, you found me." "I read every letter," she said, tears streaming freely now, no reason left to hold them back. "Every single one. I know the truth, Dad. I know what really happened." He pulled back just enough to look at her face, hands framing it like he was memorizing something he'd been terrified he would never get to see again. "You grew up," he said, voice wrecked. "You grew up, and I missed every single day of it." "You didn't miss it," Sloane said fiercely. "You were there, in every letter, every lesson you gave me before all this happened. You were there the whole time, Dad, even when I didn't understand why I could shoot a rifle better than anyone else on my base." Something in his face broke open at that, grief and relief tangled together so completely she couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. "I used to imagine this," he whispered. 1,000 different versions. Sometimes you were still 9, running toward me across the yard. Sometimes you were exactly like this, older, stronger than I ever gave myself credit for raising. I never once imagined I'd deserve either version showing up to find me. "You deserved it more than anyone," Sloane said fiercely. "Every single day you sat here, Dad, you deserved someone coming." His hands, when they came up to hold her face, were shaking badly, and not just from weakness. Sloane felt the heat coming off his skin, saw the gray pallor underneath his eyes, and some clinical part of her, the part that had spent a career reading bodies for what they weren't saying out loud, understood immediately that something was very wrong. "Dad?" she said carefully. "How long have you been sick?" He closed his eyes. "Longer than I want to tell you." "Tell me anyway." "They stopped treating it a year ago," Everett Ashworth said quietly. "Once they decided I wasn't useful as leverage anymore, they stopped caring whether I lived long enough to matter." Sloane's medical training took over before grief could. Hands already moving, checking his pulse, his breathing, the alarming heat radiating off skin that should never have felt this warm. But underneath the training, underneath every instinct that had kept her steady through years of trauma, bays, and firefights, some deep and desperate part of her was screaming that she might have found him only in time to lose him again. "We need to move," Corrigan said quietly from the doorway, watching the corridor. "Now, Ashworth, before someone notices the guard rotation didn't check in." Sloane nodded, wiping her face with the back of one hand, and helped her father to his feet with the same steady patience he'd once used to teach her how to hold a rifle still. They got him out through the same gap in the fence, Corrigan and one of Kessler's men carrying most of his weight. Sloane, walking beside him with one hand pressed to his back the entire way, refusing to let go even for a second. They were 300 meters from the extraction point when the floodlights came on. "Contact!" Kessler barked, and the world dissolved into gunfire and shouting, Corrigan returning fire while dragging Everett behind cover, Sloane's whole body flooding with an old, familiar clarity that pushed fear somewhere far enough away to function. Rounds cracked overhead, chewing concrete 6 feet from where her father lay pressed flat against the ground, and Sloane realized, with a cold, distant part of her mind, that she was no longer thinking like a medic. She was thinking like the girl in the tall grass, the one who'd been trained for exactly this moment 2 decades before she ever understood why. She took the rifle from Kessler's spare kit without asking, found a position behind a low concrete barrier, and started returning fire, with the same patient, deliberate precision she'd shown on that first ridge months ago. One shot, then another. Each one measured, each one exactly as much force as the moment required, and not 1 ounce more. "Where did you learn to do that?" one of Kessler's men shouted over the gunfire, disbelief plain in his voice even now. "My father," Sloane shouted back, and put down the man advancing on their flank with a single round that ended the argument entirely. And that was when she saw him. Admiral Grant Halloway, stepping out from behind a supply truck, sidearm raised, flanked by 2 men in unmarked tactical gear. He hadn't sent subordinates to handle this personally. He'd come himself, which told Sloane everything she needed to know about how much he had left to lose. "You should have taken my advice, Doctor," Holloway called across the open ground, voice carrying flat and cold over the gunfire.
Old ghosts stay buried for a reason.
Not this one, Sloan called back, rifle already up, steady, patient still. Not anymore. The standoff lasted less than a minute, though it felt considerably longer. Both sides frozen in the particular stillness that comes right before something irreversible happens. "Put it down, Admiral," Kessler said, his own weapon leveled, voice carrying the weight of every year he'd spent believing in a lie he never wanted to believe.
It's over. There are enough people who know the truth now. Killing every last one of us doesn't bury it anymore.
"You have no idea what you're interfering with," Holloway said, and for the first time something cracked in his composure, something desperate underneath the careful control. "Do you understand what happens to this country's credibility if this ever becomes public? Do you understand how many careers, how many operations, how much trust collapses if people find out what you did to protect yourself?" Sloan finished for him, voice steady even as her heart pounded. "Not the country. You. Every single day you let a 9-year-old girl believe her father was a coward. You were protecting yourself." Holloway's composure hardened. His sidearm didn't waver, but something in his eyes did. "Your father found something he shouldn't have found," he said. "I did what any man in my position would have done." "You buried an innocent man," Sloan said. "You let his wife die believing a lie. You let his daughter grow up ashamed of the best man she ever knew. And now you're standing here trying to convince yourself that was some kind of duty instead of what it actually was." "Which was cowardice," Sloan said. "The exact thing you spent 18 years pretending my father was guilty of." Behind her, she heard her father's ragged breathing, weak but steady, and something in that sound gave her a strength she didn't know she still had left after everything the night had already cost her.
"Look at him," Sloan said, gesturing without taking her eyes off Holloway. "Look at what you did to a man who never once in his entire life ran from anything that scared him. And ask yourself honestly, Admiral, whether you could say the same about the choices you've made every single day since." For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Holloway's shoulders dropped just slightly, the fight going out of him in a way that had nothing to do with the guns still leveled on both sides. "I could have you all killed here," he said quietly, "buried with the rest of this facility's secrets. Nobody would ever know." "You could," Sloan agreed, "but you won't, because somewhere in the last 18 years, underneath everything you built to protect yourself, I don't think you've forgotten what my father actually was. And I don't think you've fully forgiven yourself for what you did to him either." Something moved across Holloway's face, quick, unguarded, gone almost before Sloan could name it. Regret. His weapon lowered, slow, almost involuntary, and in the space of that single motion, Kessler's team closed the distance and took him into custody before he could change his mind about anything. Sloan stood there a moment longer, rifle finally lowering, watching the man who'd destroyed 18 years of her life get led away in restraints by the same soldiers he'd once commanded, without question. She thought standing there in the floodlit dark that she should have felt triumphant. Instead, she just felt tired and grateful and desperate to get her father somewhere safe before his body gave out entirely. "Medevac's inbound," Corrigan called from behind her. 2 minutes out." "Then let's get him home," Sloan said, and turned back to where her father lay waiting, patient and still, exactly the way he'd taught her to be her whole life. The flight home took 14 hours, most of it spent in a military medical transport with her father hooked to monitors that beeped his heartbeat back at her every 4 seconds. The same rhythm she'd once counted for Voss. The same fragile proof that a person was still, for now, still here. He slept for the first several hours, exhaustion finally catching up to a body that had been running on adrenaline and 18 years of hope. Sloan sat beside him the entire time, unwilling to close her eyes even for a moment, terrified that if she looked away, she'd wake to find this had all been some cruel, elaborate dream her grief had finally decided to construct for her. He woke somewhere over open water, blinking against the transport's dim cabin lights, and found her still watching him. "You haven't slept," he said, voice rough. Neither of you until about 6 hours ago. I've had 18 years of practice, he said, and something in the dry, tired humor of it broke her heart and mended it at the same time, because it sounded exactly like the father she remembered underneath all the years and all the damage.
I need to tell you something, Everett said somewhere over the ocean voice, weak but steady.
Before we land, and this becomes about hospitals and hearings and everything else that's about to happen to both of us.
Okay.
There was a chance to run, he said, early on, before Holloway's men fully closed the net. A window, maybe 6 hours, where I could have disappeared somewhere they'd never have found me.
Sloane's breath caught. Why didn't you take it? Because 4 of my men were still out there, Everett said. Waiting on an extraction I was the only one who could authorize. If I ran, they didn't come home. So I stayed, and I authorized the extraction, and by the time it was done, the window had closed, and there wasn't a version of the story left where I got to save myself too. Tears were sliding down Sloane's face freely now, 18 years of anger dissolving into something far more complicated.
You could have come home to me, she whispered. You could have chosen me. I did choose you, Everett said, taking her hand in both of his trembling ones. Every single day since, in every letter, in every hour I spent hoping you'd somehow find your way to this exact moment.
I just didn't get to choose the easy way of doing it. Some love isn't measured by what a person is willing to walk toward, Sloane girl. It's measured by what they're willing to stand still and protect, even when standing still costs everything. She held his hand a long moment, letting the words settle somewhere deep somewhere that had been waiting 18 years to finally understand them.
Those 4 men, she said eventually. Did they make it home? All 4? Everett said something proud flickering through the exhaustion in his voice. Raised families. Built lives. One of them named his son after me, if you can believe that. I used to lie awake in that cell some nights thinking about it. Thinking that whatever else got taken from me, that much at least I got to keep.
That's not nothing, Dad.
No, he agreed quietly. It's not nothing at all. It's the only thing that made 18 years feel like it meant something instead of just feeling like a waste. She held his hand the rest of the flight, saying nothing more because there was nothing left that needed saying. Only 18 years of love finally allowed to exist out loud instead of buried in paper and silence.
The hearing took months. Admiral Grant Holloway's court-martial became the kind of story that dominated headlines for exactly as long as headlines are willing to dwell on uncomfortable truths before moving on to the next one. And by the end of it, Everett Ashworth's name had been formally, officially, permanently cleared. Sloane testified twice. The first time she spoke about the letters, laying them one by one on a table in front of officers who listened in a silence so complete she could hear her own heartbeat between sentences. The second time she spoke about the facility, the rescue, the moment Holloway's weapon finally lowered, and watched the color drain slowly from the faces of men who'd spent careers believing the story they'd been told. Pruitt testified too, hands shaking the entire time, voice cracking more than once. But he didn't stop, didn't waver, didn't let 18 years of silence win one final round. Gordon testified after him, offering up every falsified document he'd ever processed, every signature he'd ever filed, under orders he should have questioned, accepting whatever consequences came his way with a kind of exhausted relief that looked almost like peace. Holloway said very little in his own defense. By the end, there wasn't much left to say that would have changed anything. He didn't get to see all of it. The illness that had gone untreated for a year took him 6 weeks after they brought him home in a hospital bed, surrounded by people who finally, at long last, knew exactly who he really was. Those 6 weeks became the most complete gift of Sloane's life. She learned things about her father she'd never known, how he took his coffee, what songs he still remembered all the words to, the particular sound of his laugh when something actually struck him as funny, instead of the careful, controlled version he'd shown the world for 30 years of service. One afternoon, sitting together on the hospital room's small balcony, while a nurse pretended not to hover nearby, Everett asked her to bring the rifle range certificate she'd earned years ago, the one she kept folded at the bottom of a drawer because she'd never had anyone to show it to who'd understand what it meant. He held it a long time, reading her scores, twice, 3 times. Something fierce and proud moving behind his tired eyes.
"You beat my old record," he said finally, voice thick. "I had a good teacher." "You had better instincts than I ever did," he said. "I just gave you the starting point. Everything after that was you."
She sat with him in comfortable silence after that, watching the sun move across a hospital courtyard neither of them would have imagined sharing 18 years ago, and understood that this, exactly this, ordinary and quiet and entirely unremarkable to anyone watching, was the thing she'd been fighting for the whole time.
Not vindication, not justice, though she'd take that too. Just this. An afternoon, a conversation. A father who finally got to be proud of her out loud. He asked her another afternoon whether she planned to stay in the Navy after everything settled. She told him she didn't know yet. He nodded slowly, considering it, the way he'd once considered wind calls and range cards, patient, unhurried. "Whatever you decide," he said, "decide it because it's yours. Not because of anything you're still trying to prove to a ghost." He squeezed her hand. "I've caused you enough of that already." "You didn't cause any of it, Dad. Holloway did." "Maybe," he allowed, "but you carried it. And I'd like the rest of your life to be lighter than the first 27 years were, if I get any say in it at all." She laughed, wet and unexpected, the sound surprising them both. "That's a lot of say for a man who just got out of a black site." "Fair," he said, smiling despite everything. "I'll settle for a vote then. Just a vote." It was a small joke, the smallest thing in the world, and it was also the first time in 18 years that Sloane had heard her father make one, and she held on to the sound of it like it was worth more than every answer she'd spent months chasing across 2 continents. He asked about her mother often in those weeks, wanting every detail Sloane could give him, grieving a woman he hadn't been allowed to grieve properly until now, 18 years late, and somehow exactly on time. "She never stopped loving you," Sloane told him one evening, holding his hand in a hospital room full of quiet machines. "Even when she couldn't say it out loud, even when the shame made it too hard to talk about you at all." "I know," Everett said softly. "I felt it. Even from wherever I was, some things travel further than people think they do." "I wish she'd lived to see this," Sloane said, throat tight. "I wish she could have known the truth before it was too late for her too." "She knew," Everett said. Somewhere underneath everything the world told her to believe, some part of her always knew. Grief doesn't erase certainty, Sloane girl. It just makes certainty too heavy to carry out loud. Sloane thought of her mother's silence at the kitchen table all those years ago, the wine, the changed subject, the fear that had looked so much like doubt from the outside. Maybe Gordon had been right about that in the end. Maybe fear and love really did look the same sometimes from a distance too far away to tell them apart. Sloane held his hand until the very end. Kessler stood at the foot of the bed, Corrigan beside him, Voss in a wheelchair he was still recovering into. Gordon Halstead, quiet in the corner, with tears he no longer bothered hiding. "I'm not afraid," Everett told her near the end, voice barely above a whisper. "I got to say it to your face after all. I got to come home." "You did," Sloane said, holding his hand tight enough to memorize the shape of it. "You came home, Dad. You're not a ghost anymore." He smiled the same smile from the one photograph Pruitt had kept turned face down for 18 years, and closed his eyes for the last time with his daughter's hand in his, and his name, finally, entirely his own again. They held the memorial at the cabin, not the base, because some homecomings belong to family and not to flags. Sloane stood at the edge of the tree line with an urn in her hands and 18 letters folded carefully in her jacket pocket, close to her heart, exactly where they'd sat the whole drive back from Pruitt's overgrown lawn all those months ago. Kessler stood beside her, Corrigan a step behind, hat in hand,
Voss, walking now with only a cane, had made the drive despite doctors' protests. Gordon and Pruitt stood together near the tree line. Two old men, finally free of 18 years of separate private guilt, neither one quite able to look the other in the eye yet, both of them slowly learning how.
He'd have liked this, Kessler said quietly. Quiet, no flags, just people who actually knew him. He would have, Sloane agreed.
Voss cleared his throat, leaning on his cane. "For what it's worth," he said, "I've served under a lot of officers in my career, read a lot of files. I never met your father, Ashworth, but I feel like I know him now.
And I think the Navy lost something rare the day it decided a man like that was easier to bury than to believe."
"Thank you, Commander Beckett," he said. "I think we're past Commander by now." Corrigan stepped forward next, turning his hat over in his hands. "I said some things about your father," he said, "back before I knew any better."
"I want you to know I've thought about that a lot since. About how easy it is to believe the version of a story that requires the least from you. I don't think I'll ever stop being sorry about that." "You already made it right," Sloane said. "Every day since that firefight. That's enough, Tate. More than enough."
Pruitt and Gordon didn't speak, not yet standing, instead in a silence that had finally, after 18 years, stopped being a silence built on guilt and started becoming something closer to grief, shared honestly between two men who'd both loved the same good man in their own imperfect, frightened ways. Later, walking back toward the cabin, Sloane saw them fall into step together for the first time since she'd known either of them, shoulders nearly touching. Neither one saying much, both of them apparently finding it easier to grieve side by side than alone. She thought that might be its own small kind of forgiveness, the kind that didn't need words to count. Sloane knelt at the base of the third ridge, the same ridge from the letter, the same coordinates that had led her home to a truth she'd spent her whole life afraid to go looking for, and released her father's ashes into wind that smelled like pine and old summers, and every lesson he'd ever patiently, lovingly taught her.
In for 4. Hold for 4. Out for 4.
She thought kneeling there of the first letter she'd ever read in Pruitt's driveway, tears streaming down her face for a father she barely remembered. "You are the best thing I ever did in this life," he'd written. She understood now, watching his ashes catch the wind and scatter out over land he'd once called the only honest place left in the country, that the reverse had always been true as well. He was the best thing that had ever happened to her, buried under 18 years of a lie that had finally, at long last, run out of places left to hide. Some things she understood now, standing there with grief and peace tangled together in her chest for the first time in 18 years, weren't about winning or losing at all. They were about, finally, after everything, being still enough to let the truth come home. She stood there a long while after the others had begun the quiet walk back toward the cabin, alone, with the wind and the trees, and the particular hard-won piece of a story finally allowed to end the way it always should have. Somewhere behind her she could hear Kessler's low voice telling Corrigan some old story about her father, the kind of story that used to only exist in whispers, and now finally could be told out loud in daylight to anyone willing to listen. She smiled, wiped the last of her tears away, and turned to follow them home.